My mother-in-law came to my front door on a Wednesday morning and told me I had to give her a key to my house. She said it like it was normal, like she had forgotten that I lived there, like the house belonged to whoever could declare it theirs loudest. She stood on my porch with a paper bag, the cheap floral blouse she wore every Sunday, and a look I had seen on her at family dinners when she meant to unsettle someone. She wanted the key because she said she was worried. She wanted the key because she'd helped us. She wanted the key because her son, my husband, had signed something once that gave her permission to check in. It hurt because the key is private. The key is the clean, small fact that says, my children are safe here and that I choose who crosses the threshold. And it hurt because she asked for it not as a favor, but as an entitlement. And it hurt because when she asked, my husband was on the other end of the phone in our bedroom saying nothing. I changed the locks that afternoon, and I changed the address where the family thought we were staying. I did those two small, brutal things with my hands shaking and my voice steady. I did them because I understood suddenly and with a kind of cold clarity that the dispute wasn't about keys. It was about control. We bought the house in the spring of 2016. It's modest. 3 bedrooms, a yard big enough for a kid to run in circles, a mortgage that took us 30 years to sign up for and 10 years to start feeling secure about. We put down $25,000. That number matters because it started the story. Wait, my mother-in-law had insisted on contributing $10,000 of it. She wrote us a check in a colored envelope and said, "It's easier if I help." We accepted the money because we were 29 and exhausted, and because Mark, my husband, said she'd always been generous. We signed the forms in the title office, and the deed showed our names. Everything looked normal. It stopped being normal the year our first daughter turned 3. The first time she asked for keys was framed like an offer. "If something happens," she said, "you'll want me to be able to get in." She wrote it in a message after I posted a picture of the baby asleep on the couch. At the time, I thought she was being helpful. She had watched the baby when I had to cover shifts. She had brought dinners. Later, I understood that the offer was a wedge. We are not poor. Mark works in construction management. I teach 3rd grade part-time and pick up freelance editing when the classroom clears. Our monthly mortgage is just under $1,900. Property tax and insurance add another $500 a month once you average it out. The house had been a compromise, a place near his mother's neighborhood that let us be close to family help when the kids were small. We used her childcare sometimes. We accepted Saturday night dinners. We accepted the help because for the first 5 years, it felt like help. Dependence is a small, stealthy thing. It is a friend who sits on your couch until she eats the cushions, the down payment that came with a look of expectation, the babysitting that arrived with comments about how you handled the kids, the fact that my work schedule fit around her availability, which meant I never pushed Mark to take on more evening work because he was the one who would drive his mother to an appointment. I thought I was a partner in a marriage. In small ways and then in larger ways, I discovered I was negotiating a private contract with a woman who had not listed herself in the fine print. After that first request, the asks multiplied. She wanted the key so she could bring things over without calling. A week later, she wanted the key because she had to check the pipes. Then she wanted the key because it would be easier when she came to babysit. Each time, she used the same language: worried, helpful, inconvenient to insist upon. Each time Mark told me, quietly, that she was only trying to help. Each time I let it slide because we were tired and we were negotiating small comforts. The problem wasn't the key at first. The problem was the willingness to concede small things until small things added up to the possibility of someone else comfortably occupying the center of our life. When I refused for the first time, she tested it. She came by on a weekday unannounced and stayed in the driveway for almost an hour, leaning into her car, brushing leaves from the hood. She walked to the edge of the porch and called, "I'll just set this here," and dropped a casserole near the door. She expected me to open the door, to be grateful. I did not. I watched her from the kitchen window as I cleaned up, and I told myself that she would leave. She did, but not before placing a printed notice about grandchildren activities, signed and initialed, throughout the house, as if she owned the calendar. And when she switched from social maneuvers to legal threats, I realized how fast the balance could shift. She said at dinner one evening that she had spoken to a lawyer and that should anything happen to Mark, she had a document that would allow her to manage the house. She used the phrase "manage the house" in a way that sounded like a synonym for own. She spoke it as if I might find it reasonable. I remember the cup of tea going cold in my hand, the quiet of the kitchen as if the sound had been vacuumed away. Mark rolled his eyes and said it was fine, nothing more than paperwork. But then, several weeks later, an envelope came addressed to his mother with our street name and, shockingly, a different unit number we had never used. She had, it turned out, listed a forwarding address for a utility bill to the post office. That was the moment I felt the space close down. She had moved our mail without asking. It was bureaucratic and petty, and it was also an act of claiming the house as a thing she could administrate. She did not ask. She declared. After she demanded the key, I told Mark I would not give it. She called him from my porch. He stood inside the kitchen and listened while she used the same voice she used at family Christmas, the one that made his shoulders tense. He told me later that she sounded wounded, almost as if I had taken from her something she had been promised. Then he walked out of the house to the driveway and talked to her for 20 minutes. When he returned, he did not look at me. He nodded at the boxes in the back seat of her car and said, "She's coming over tonight to stay." She arrived that night with a suitcase and a confidence that felt illegal. She told me she would stay in the guest room and that she would help with bedtime. When the kids were small and exhausted, it is a compulsion to say yes. Parental exhaustion is an economy that favors anyone who offers relief. I let her stay the first night because I had no bandwidth for confrontation. The second night she refused to leave. She said she wanted to check on the house. She walked into rooms without knocking. She rearranged the pantry. At dawn, she woke the children to make breakfast and then insisted they go to her house for a day so she could spoiling them a little. When I objected, she said, with a casual cruelty that stung more than a shout, "You're overreacting." And you always do. Every escalation followed the same arc. A demand, my attempt to push back, her amplitude increasing, my feeling of being flanked and diminished. By the time I had changed the locks that Wednesday, 3 months had passed since that first demand. There were other things that had happened in those months, small betrayals that aggregated into a lattice of pressure. She started showing up at my daughter's school events and sitting uninvited in the front row. She took pictures during performances and posted them with captions that implied she had primary caregiving duties. She called my husband's brother and said I was unstable. She sent me a text telling me I was lucky she was involved. My friends began to look at me the way people look at someone with a complicated stain on their shirt, awkward and uncertain. The house felt surveilled. The sameness of her involvement made me exhausted in a new way. I changed the locks because for the first time I felt real fear. She had crossed the line between being overbearing and being a person who assumed she had the right to enter when she pleased. The idea of that made me imagine small violences. A parent in the middle of the night taking a child to a car, a closet rifled through. She'd used the language of care to justify acts that were simply invasions. I told myself quietly that if the worst thing I did that day was change a lock, then at least something had shifted in my hands. When I told Mark, he took it personally. He felt betrayed by me. He felt I had made a unilateral decision that involved his mother. His anger was private and sharp. He said I had escalated without talking to him. And he accused me of humiliation. He wanted the spare key surrendered. He wanted me to be reasonable. He could not or would not say that his mother had behaved badly. That was the first concrete sign that this was not simply a dispute over boundaries. This was a family choosing sides. She retaliated in small administrative ways she knew would sting. First, she started calling my boss. A woman I had said hello to at summer picnics. She told my supervisor in polite, measured phrases that she was concerned about the children's care and that she was available to help. The calls were never accusatory in an obvious sense. They were a drip of suggestion. Then she called our mortgage company, asking if there was any paperwork they needed related to the down payment she had given, as if she were preserving evidence of her concern. She sent certified letters, one informing us she had taken steps to protect the family's interest. She filed a report with our homeowners association about a minor landscaping violation and copied us on it. The message was never direct, but it was persistent. I could be made uncomfortable in quiet, unavoidable ways. I reacted by tightening the circle. I installed a smart lock. I set up a Ring camera and hung a sign that said in diplomatic print that the property was private and that visitation required notice. I changed my mailing address for anything that might be forwarded and set up a P.O. box. I called an attorney for a consultation. They advised me to keep records. I began to catalogue each interaction with dates and times. I recorded conversations when I remembered to. The first escalation loop ended with a physical barrier, the new lock, and my feeling of increased safety. The second loop picked up speed. Once my tools of privacy were in place, she escalated to the most effective lever she possessed: family shame. She texted my husband and his siblings long, dramatic messages implying neglect. She suggested in a voice guilted into righteousness that I was unreliable, late to pick up our child, forgetful with school forms. She selectively shared images and stories of times we'd been tired. The narrative she built was precise. She painted me as someone who could not manage alone, someone who required oversight. She used small truths, my fatigue, my mistakes, to craft a justification for the control she sought. Mark's side of the house split in an invisible way I couldn't reconcile with honesty. He did not stand with her, not overtly. He did not, for the most part, stand with me. He teetered. He began to take calls from his mother in the car. He left the room when she did. So he sometimes came home late with a look that told me he'd agreed to something I had not. The marriage leaned toward the side of the family that had more social power, the side that had been loudest and proudest about saving us in the down payment envelope. The consequences were concrete. Our joint account saw transactions I hadn't authorized. Small checks disappeared for family help. An insurance inspection was scheduled without my knowledge, and a contractor Mark's mother insisted upon gave us an estimate that was unnecessary. Each time I pushed back, I was told I was being difficult. Each time I took action to protect the house, we paid for it with something else, a cooling silence between Mark and me, a weekend of his absence, another small administrative cost. I could have left. On paper, I had options. My sister lived 2 states away. My friends offered couches. But leaving was not merely packing and moving. Leaving would place 2 small children in motion mid-year, pull them from the school where they'd finally found friends, and send our bills into chaos. Leaving would also mean taking financial responsibility for the entire mortgage without Mark's contribution. The mortgage and the kids anchored me. The pressure ratcheted up when she produced a document. It arrived one grey afternoon in a cardboard envelope. It was neat, stamped, signed. It wasn't in itself evidence of ownership. It was a power of attorney. Limited, she claimed, to property management in case of incapacity. She had Mark's name on it and a notary stamp. When I saw it, my stomach dropped. It was not proof that she could enter, but it was proof of a strategy. So proof that she was building an infrastructure for control. Mark moved like someone watching 2 distant arguments and trying to be neutral. He said he had signed something ages ago because she'd asked him to fill in a form for a matter he'd never read. He said he didn't remember. He sounded like a man who had been raised to avoid confrontation with his mother. His inability to step forward left a vacuum that she filled with force. Things got worse. She called the school and said she could pick the kids up in an emergency. She arrived at parent-teacher conferences and sat between teachers and me with a posture that implied she had rights. She sent me a list of suggestions on how I might be a better mother, and it arrived via certified mail, so it felt official. It read like bureaucracy designed to shame. I began to lose sleep. I began to dread the chime on my phone. The low point came in a single quiet afternoon. I sat on the floor of the living room with 2 piles of bills and an empty cafeteria tray someone from the neighborhood had dropped off because they'd heard rumors. One collection notice referenced the mortgage being in arrears, an error I could prove was inaccurate. Another note referenced my husband's absence from home. My attorney called in the middle of the day and, in a voice that was efficient and matter-of-fact, told me that without Mark's willingness to cooperate, anything beyond harassment would be expensive and slow. Legal motions cost money I did not want to spend. My savings had been eroded by months of small payments to accountants and locksmiths. Then, while I was staring at that stack of paper, the house phone, an old Univox we kept for emergencies, rang. It was Mark's sister, Lisa. She had been quiet through all of this. She is the kind of person who avoids taking sides in public because she wants her relationship with everyone intact. She said, "You need to know what she said to me." She paused. She told me she was going to make it official if anyone got in the way. In that pause, there was a sound like a door closing. Lisa had not called before. She had been silent because she didn't want to be dragged in. Her call was a Fisher. She told me that at a brunch, while she had been nursing a coffee, their mother had spoken in a voice unnervingly calm about sorting the house and getting the deed in order. She had said she'd already spoken to a broker and that the paperwork would be easier if Mark lived closer. She had laughed at the idea of me being difficult. That was the low point because it proved the thing I feared. She was not disorganized or careworn. She had a plan. She had used kindness to create access and paperwork to try to make it permanent. I felt trapped the way an animal feels trapped in a corner. The walls had names and dates. I thought about the children and what leaving would mean. I thought about Mark and what his silence meant. For the first time, I understood how a person can be legally right and practically powerless. I sat on the floor and cried the rug dry. The small acts of resistance had not stopped her. They had only delayed the moment when this would become a matter for someone with a gavel, a courtroom, or a signed order. The turning point was not theatrical. It was a mistake she made, small, human, stupid. She left her phone on my kitchen counter. It sounds absurd to say it that way because phones are left all the time. But the mistake was a flaring, immediate opportunity. She'd come by to pick up a casserole she'd supposedly dropped off, and she forgot the phone as she left. It was glossy and black and warm from being in her bag. I stood in the kitchen with my hand on it for what felt like a long time. I thought about the ethics of touching someone's property, about how quick the next step would be, about how much I had already lost. In the end, curiosity and caution and sheer tactical thinking blended. I opened the phone not to dive into secrets, but to see if there was something I could use to understand the plan. The messages were a map. There were texts to a woman named Karen. "We'll start the paperwork Monday. Karen will file the forms. I will be at the office." There were voice notes, one where she laughed and said, "If it comes to it, I'll say I was worried about the kids. That buys me time." There was an audio memo in which she said, speaking to someone named Paul. He signed. He gave me his word. It's messy, but it will be finalized. It was not a confession. It was a live document of intention. It became, in a way that paperwork had not clear proof. It showed she was acting deliberately with the intention to establish legal control. There was the arrogance of someone who thought they were above being proved wrong. I took a copy of the recordings to the lawyer. The lawyer, after listening, sat in a chair and was suddenly quiet. He told me we had enough to seek an injunction to stop her from taking further legal steps. At least temporarily, he explained the sequence. File a motion, ask for restraining measures, present evidence that she intended to manipulate the process. Legalese is not poetry, it is careful leverage. For the first time since the locked door, I had a practical lever that might change the arc. When Mark learned that I had the voice memos, the argument was immediate and raw. He accused me of violating privacy. He said I had gone too far by taking a phone and using it to entrap his mother. He said she was my husband's mother and I should have handled it differently. He told me if I handed the phone back, perhaps therapy would help. I said I would hand the phone back if she returned the papers and apologized and withdrew any attempt to install herself in our home. He said that was unrealistic. The divorce talk had been a whisper at the edges of our marriage for years. It had not been present in my mind until I saw the way Mark folded himself around his mother's motives. Once I held the phone and played the recordings, the possibility that our marriage might not survive became painfully real. What, he left for the night and did not come back. The legal motion took time, which meant I had to live in a house that felt like the site of an unwanted contest. It meant I had to keep my children smiling at school and make sure their lunches had fruit. It meant that the quiet hum of the house was often a noise I could not ignore. When the court date came, we sat in a small room and the judge was patient in an institutional way. The voice memos played. She listened, then asked for more details. She asked questions about the down payment. She asked whether Mark had been coerced into signing anything else. We produced the signed deed. We showed the mortgage statements. The judge granted a temporary injunction preventing Mark's mother from entering the property or taking any steps that could affect the property's ownership. The order was limited and bureaucratic. It did not resolve the full spectrum of the problem, but it was real. The consequences were not cinematic. They were domestic and precise. She could not come into our house anymore. The restraining order required her to stay 150 feet away, which meant she could not stand in the driveway and remind me of her generosity. That had an immediate practical effect. I slept through a whole night without imagining someone in the hall. But it also meant that Mark saw, in the official language of the court, that her behavior had been documented and judged inappropriate. He sat with the minute order in his lap and then left the house. He did not call his mother. He called his sister. The family broke in visible ways. The holidays were awkward embarrassments. My in-laws did not stop talking about the decision, and when they did, they used the phrase legal mess as if the decision was a temporary inconvenience they would wait out. My relationship with Mark did not repair overnight. He came back intermittently. We tried therapy twice. The first therapist closed his notebook and said we needed legal counsel to handle the property dispute before deep relationship work could proceed. We rented separate rooms in the same house for a while, which felt ugly and adult and necessary. There were financial consequences. Legal fees are a blunt instrument. They cut into savings and force renegotiation of priorities. We refinanced some things. We got a payment plan set up for the attorney. My earnings were a relief, but small compared to the sums required to stall a determined relative. And there were social consequences. The neighborhood is small. People took sides in whispered ways. The woman who used to bring us pies began to avoid the porch. Mark's siblings divided and retreated. Someone brought up minor infractions that had nothing to do with us, and suddenly our names were attached to small rumors. The cost of preserving our home was more than money. It was the slow thinning of social fabric. There was also an unexpected outcome. Lisa, who had been silent, became a witness. She testified about the brunch and the voice memo. She was the one person in the family who had enough distance to see the pattern without wanting to step on anyone's toes. Her testimony was not fiery. It was the opposite. It was careful and ordinary, and therefore credible in a way that aggressive anger never would have been. It mattered. In the months that followed, the situation settled into a new shape. The injunction expired, and we agreed, through lawyers, to a boundary arrangement that limited her involvement to scheduled visits and required notification in writing for anything resembling the management she had imagined. She was not prosecuted, she was restricted. Mark and I repaired some of the habit of our marriage, but not all of it. We learned, in the slow way of marriages under pressure, to separate the anger at his mother from our relationship, which is messy and real. The thing that felt like the most honest consequence was not the papers or the quiet legal victory. It was the way my children began to use the word home without hesitation again. They did not know exactly what had happened. They only knew that the house that used to feel watched now felt like ours. They grew into a lax ownership of the couch cushions and the backyard that is the nicest kind of mundane. I do not tell this story as a boast. I do not claim to have engineered a masterful plan. I told my lawyer the truth, everything I had and everything I could show, and he did what lawyers do. He used those fragments to build a provisional shield. The record mattered. The recording mattered. The fact that I had taken small steps over months, keeping receipts, taking screenshots, noting times, mattered. Those tedious actions were the tools of survival. They were not dramatic. They were practical. There is a cost that lingers. My relationship with Mark's family is fractured. Thanksgiving will always be a negotiation. My mother-in-law still calls on holidays and leaves messages that sound like apologies wrapped halfway around an explanation. Sometimes I think of the envelope of cash she gave us in 2016 and the soft implied obligation that accompanied it. Money can be a kindness and it can be a leash. The house cost us almost 4 years of saving and a quiet endurance I had not known I possessed. I changed the locks the day she demanded the key, and then again when the injunction went through, upgrading to a system that required an encrypted code. I also changed the address where anything private was sent. I have a P.O. box now. I do not tell Mark's mother where our bills are processed. The changes are small acts of self-preservation. They are also acts that remind me we are the authors of our own domestic space. There were quieter consequences I had not expected. I learned how easily a person can be made to feel like an intruder in her own life. I learned that kindness can be weaponized. I learned that people we rely on can, with time and intent, convert generosity into leverage. Most of all, I learned that the language of boundaries is often more effective than the language of anger. The house remained ours. The mortgage continued to be paid. We kept the kids in the same schools. We replaced the picture frames that had been knocked off the wall during a late-night argument and bought a new doormat that says, simply, welcome. The mat is for us. It is not a message to anyone else. It is a steady thing I see when I come home from work. It feels sometimes like a small victory. When I look back at the file folders I kept, screenshots and bills and the pages of the minute order, they look like small, boring pieces of paper. They are not heroic. They are the paperwork of a life defended. They are proof that attention to detail is practical courage. They are proof that you can be worn down slowly and still stand up when the moment requires it. I do not end on triumph. The family remains complicated. Holidays are negotiated. Trust is not restored by legal orders. But the house is ours, and our children sleep under the roof that we maintain. Mark and I did not break the marriage. We changed it. It is quieter than it was, and in that sound there is space for cautious repair. If you ask me what I would do differently, I might say I would keep better records earlier. I might say I would have insisted on clearer boundaries from the start, but those are not lessons I will lecture about from a pulpit. They are small practical notes I carry with me now. Keep receipts, say no, secure the door. I tell you this because sometimes people imagine these fights as sweeping dramas with a villain and a hero. That is not my story. It is a series of annoyances and then a decision to act. It is an accumulation of evidence and a judge's staff, and the humdrum bravery of making phone calls and paying bills and holding a child's hand. Control is rarely stolen in fireworks. It is boldly assumed, paper-clipped together, and then defended. If anything, changing the locks and the address were the least dramatic things I did. The more difficult work was learning how to hold a boundary across a marriage and a family that did not always agree with me. That is the kind of thing that takes more time than a change of locks and more patience than a court date. It is the work of living. If my voice sounds steady now, it is because I have expended what energy I have on the things I can change. The rest, relationships frayed, the softness of holidays, is something I carry and attend to as the years go on. If you like this story, please leave a like. If you want to hear more confessions and stories like this, consider subscribing. Have you ever had to change a lock or set a hard boundary with family? I'd love to read your experience in the comments.